This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing stated on it, either by its hosts or any guests, is to be construed as psychological, medical, or legal advice. You're listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. I'm Haley Radke. Today's guest is the incredible Stephanie Drenka, and I say incredible because she saw the need for an online platform for underrepresented communities and went ahead and built it in one night. Stephanie and I talk about her shifting views of adoption over time, how being raised in a predominantly white community caused her to experience internalized racism, and why sometimes when you see the need in a community, you've got to be the one to go ahead and fill the gap. We hear how Stephanie created Visible magazine. I do want to warn you that in today's episode, there is a mention of self-harm. We wrap up with some recommended resources, and as always, links to everything we'll be talking about today are on the website adopteeson.com. Let's listen in. I'm so pleased to welcome to Adoptees On, Stephanie Drenka. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you so much for having me and giving me this space to share my story.
So excited to hear from you today. Would you mind sharing a bit of your story with us to start off with?
Absolutely. So I think my story begins similarly to many transracial Korean adoptees in a certain era. I was born in 1986 and I was adopted at the age of 3 months. And so I was one of the youngest infants, I would say, to leave Korea and come to America, and my adoptive family was based in Chicago. So the story is I knew it for most of my life began in the airport. The first pictures that I had, besides the one that my parents were given by the adoptive agency, was my parents carrying me out of the airport doors and my adoptive family being there to greet me. We have a really beautiful video of my arrival, and that was where I thought my story started. I arrived in Chicago. I grew up in a very white-centric community, both in Marietta, Georgia, and then later South Lake, Texas, which I'll have to fill you in on later because it's been in the news recently. And I lived a very, I would say, quote, happy life to the outside world. I was very involved in theater and choir. I loved music. I loved reading and writing, all things the arts. My mom was a librarian and my dad worked for American Airlines, so we traveled. I have a younger brother who's their biological son who is very close to my age, so we were close growing up in our younger years. And it wasn't until it was time to start looking for my next step after high school. Everyone was going, all of my theater friends were going off to auditions. My music friends were going off to their auditions. And I was looking at the shows that were on Broadway, and that was my dream at the time. And it was Flower Drum Song, Miss Saigon, The King and I. And realistically, I knew that that wasn't the future that would be the most fulfilling for me. So I went to Depaul University, which my parents had attended, and it was in Chicago. And so my criteria was I want to go somewhere that's not in Texas, that is more diverse, and that doesn't have a football team. And Depaul fell into those categories very nicely. So I was...
So I don't understand the football team thing. That's because Texans love football? Is that
Texans love football?
Okay.
And specifically my high school, South Lake Carroll, they were at the time the 5A champions, and everything revolved around football. And so I couldn't deal with
leaving football behind. Okay.
I had to leave that behind. So I went to Depaul University, and it was the first time that I was around other people who looked like me. So in South Lake, I was one of maybe 5 students of color in a graduating class of over 500 students. And everything in my high school experience and before that was about fitting in and blending in and not sticking out and trying to ignore or hide my Asianness however possible, which caused a lot of internalized racism. And I knew at that point something had to change, and I didn't know how to name it. But once I got to DePaul and I started going to, introductory meetings for the Asian Cultural Exchange or the Korean Student Organization, something happened that really shifted my view of race, because I realized not only did I have this internalized racism, but it was starting to manifest in other ways. For example, I didn't go back to another Korean student organization meeting that first quarter because I was so overwhelmed by all of the other Korean people. We were walking down the street one time and I was across the street from them, and a group from the organization waved to me, and I pretended like I didn't see them, and I walked the other direction because I was so afraid of being lumped in or having people assume that I was part of that group, and, in an unspoken way, the racism that I would face if I were to be categorized with that group. I was so used to my bubble of, oh, she's just the Asian, she's a banana, she's a Twinkie, and so I was realizing all of these kind of ugly things about myself that I didn't think about until college. It took some time, and then I went back to the Asian organizations, got really heavily involved in them, ended up taking the Asian American Studies introduction course because it was a new minor that the school was offering, and learned so much history, so much information about Asian Americans, and more specifically, how our movements coalesced or intersected with other people of color. It was the first time I felt like not only did I have a history, in the larger story of America, but I also understood my story and how I came here, why Korean adoption happened. Through that experience, I became an advocate and activist and worked on a House Resolution 121, which was calling on Japan to make a formal apology for the sexual enslavement of women and girls during World War II. So I was really involved with some activists in DC, and the resolution ended up passing unanimously. And through that experience, I was invited to attend a leadership conference sponsored by the Korean government. And that was the summer after I graduated college. So that was the first time that I had the opportunity to go back to my birth country. The conference was very heavily scheduled, so I didn't have a lot of free time. But while I was there, I decided I'm going to reach out to my adoption agency and just let them know that I'm here, see if I could take a tour. I knew that they offered tours of the maternity home and the baby's room. So I reached out, and they did ask me if they had the contact information for my foster mother, who took care of me for the first 3 months of my life. They could bring her, and they asked if I'd be interested in starting a birth search. And this was via email before I went on the trip. And I said I would just like to meet my foster mother. I was not ready to go down the birth family search route at that point. And so I arranged a visit to them. I visited the baby's home. I met my foster mother, who was so sweet. She carried with her the picture that we took right before I went on the airplane, and she told me how painful it was every time, a baby left. She would worry about what would happen to them. She wouldn't eat for several days. And she was so sweet. She gave me money. She wanted to drive me back to my hotel, but the adoption agency, the social worker, said that I had to stay and go through my file. And so that was strange to me. She said, I guess it was, standard procedure. When you come in, you go through the paperwork. And I had already seen my paperwork. My parents were really open with me. I'd seen the paragraph of information. I had, the details, my weight, my, all of the medical information that they had. And so I knew information about my birth parents. My birth mother was a single mother, and she separated from my birth father because he caused a traffic accident while he was driving a taxi, and thought it best that I be relinquished. So when we sat down with social worker, she's reading that history. She says, "Oh, it looks like your birth father passed away. in 2004. That would have been the year I graduated high school. And she gave me kind of a tissue because I was starting to get emotional and didn't have time to process that when she said, "Oh, and you have 2 older sisters. Yeah, they might have been too young. They might not know that you exist." And then she sort of closed the folder, and I'm just sitting here dumbfounded. And she was like, "So do you want to start a search?" And I'm like, "Well, of course. You just told me that I have sisters that don't know if I exist. And my birth father has already died, so I've already missed the chance to meet him. So yes, I want to start the search." And so then she explains the process to me. I signed some paperwork, and she says, "Well, what we do now is we send a telegram to the last address that we have on file for your birth mother, and we say, 'Someone born on this date is trying to contact you. Please call,' because of privacy issues. They can't be like, 'Oh, your long lost daughter is trying to reach you.'" So they send the telegram. I go back to the conference, record a YouTube video and post it because I'm so overwhelmed and I have no one to share this experience with at the time because of the time difference. My parents, are sleeping. And so I uploaded it to YouTube and just started the process, which I didn't realize would be so slow. For some reason, I thought, oh, the telegram will get sent. And, by the time I get back to the States, I'll have heard from my birth family. And, months went by with no answer. And I would follow up and they would send another telegram and they would just say, if you want to write a letter, we'll keep it on file. Well, I got very impatient and I decided I'm going to go on the Korean TV show. I Miss the Person, or I Want to See the Person, and try to find them that way. At the time, they had this series, Bogo Shipta, which means either I want to see you or I miss you. And they have people tell their stories about missing family members. Audience can call in, police detectives investigate, and then, they show the really dramatic reunions. So I went on that via Skype and nobody had any information. I never heard anything. And I just sort of closed that chapter almost entirely. It was always in the back of my mind, but I went back to my real life because we have to go back and keep going. And, I fell in love, got engaged. And as I was planning my wedding, something just felt like there was a missing piece. I was not fully engaged in the wedding planning process because in the back of my mind, I was thinking this is something that my birth family should know that I'm doing. So I reached out one more time to my adoption agency. I told, the new social worker, because they had changed so many times over the years, I'm getting married. I just want them to know that I'm happy and that, this milestone is happening. And she, I think, felt a level of empathy with me because she sent someone out to the house directly with the telegram and had them sort of walk around the house and look inside, look through the windows. And she said they reported back that it looked like no one had lived there for several years. So that was probably the last, attempt that they could make. And again, it was send pictures, write a letter, and we'll hope that they're looking for you. So at that point, I felt like I had done everything possible to find them. It was not going to happen. And it was it was a weird sense of closure. I had gone down as far as I could down this path, and I was ready to take that next step and get married. And a couple months later, I woke up on Labor Day and I was off of work. So I just was lounging around in bed, opened my computer, and I had an email that was sent overnight. And it was from the social worker saying, good news, we have located your birth mother and birth sisters, and they're excited to meet you. And had this, she had attachments with photos of them with no context and said, we're translating letters and we'll send those to you shortly. So I'm just opening this zip file of pictures and I see my family and I don't know who's who. And I can kind of guess, and it looks like grandmother, birth mother. There's sisters, but then there's little children that are probably nieces and nephews. And then there's an older boy or young man that I'm assuming is a cousin. All this information. I finally get the letters and hear the story, as much as can fit in a Word document that's being translated. But it was essentially that they had been looking for me since my birth father died. He would not let my birth mother tell the other children about me. And so as soon as he passed away, she told them the truth, and my sister started looking for me. It was my birth father that handled all of the arrangements. He was the one, he didn't want another daughter. So he forced my birth mother to relinquish me. So they didn't know what adoption agency any of this took place with. So they were going through Holt trying to find me, but I was adopted through Eastern Social Welfare Society. So they were kind of running into the same obstacles that I was, where we just missed each other. And then I found out that I had a younger brother, and that was the young man in the pictures. My birth parents were married. They were separated for a time, but got back together, had a son. And of course, that was what my birth father had wanted. So he was kept. And so then I'm seeing, these pictures in a new context. They're, my family camping or going on vacation or celebrating somebody's birthday, and this complete family unit and their lives. And I was the only one that was taken out of that equation. So, fortunately for me, my dad worked for American Airlines. He arranged for me to fly standby. Within a few months, I went in Thanksgiving to meet them and was reunited with them at the adoption agency. The social worker was there to translate for the first day and a half, essentially. And then I was on my own with them for the rest of the week, trying to get by with Google Translate. But I found out so much information on that trip that, didn't even come through in the paperwork, about my birth father, about his abusive tendencies and, the things that led up to my birth. And one of the other important things that I discovered was that the social worker broke the rules to find them for me. She had my sister's names. She looked up my middle sister's address, and she sent a telegram to her. And just realizing that one person making that decision changed, all of our lives. And also knowing that my adoption agency had their names, had a way to find them all of those years that I was looking and didn't. And so, it was so funny. My birth family gave her this huge bottle of Andong soju from their hometown of Andong to thank her, because I think we all realized this was a miracle, and she was looking out for us. So learned a lot on that trip, and again, came back to real life somehow, tried to process it, and also go back to work and get married and all of the things. And I stayed in contact with my middle sister, who speaks the most English, but also her and I were closer in age, and we just had an immediate connection. And I think it was started with our physical similarities, and the fact that my birth mother, in the letter she wrote to me, said that when she held me for the first time, I looked so much like my middle sister. And I kept thinking, how can you know that, as all babies look the same to me? But then I saw my sister, and specifically older pictures of her, because she had Korean plastic surgery. Her eyelids were different now, but looking at her in our college age, it looked like myself, like I had been photoshopped into a different setting or a different outfit. And so we just had this instant connection, because we were mirrors of each other, essentially. So her and I stayed in touch after I left, and she came to visit me in Texas with her husband and her daughter, my niece. And then I went back to visit them October, right before the pandemic in 2019, and was able to spend more time with them and have more questions answered, and leave with even more questions than I arrived. And then again, went back to work, and I work in the racial equity space, and also with my magazine, trying to elevate other adoptee voices. And yeah, I ended up telling my story for a really long time. Sorry. I forget how much it encompasses now. And I know there's still a lot that I left out, but
don't apologize. I was fascinated to hear it. And while you were talking, I was thinking, oh my goodness, I feel like your story is really unique in that you were, first of all, able to find them.
Mm-hmm.
Korean birth searches are extremely challenging from what I understand and what I've heard a lot of other guests share.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really, really, I don't know. It's like it's a privilege, right? I always think that too. For myself, my search was so easy, and I'm like, I feel like a unicorn because I know it's so hard for so many, and many won't find. So just to acknowledge that.
Mm-hmm.
When you were talking about being on the TV show, I watched that clip because you have these things up on your YouTube channel still. And what I found really interesting, and I wonder if you can comment on this and maybe kind of expand a little because of all your knowledge about Korea now and, reclaiming your Asianness. You were kind of talking about that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
The TV host is asking you questions, and then there's a translator. And the translator asked you, he's trying to ask you about your birth parents and kind of what you know. And then he says, this is a direct quote, why they gave up on you.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh my God, that's it, right? That's what we think. They gave up on us.
They gave up.
And instead of give you up. But I just thought, wow, that's kind of profound that, it's kind of probably an incorrect, phrasing to our ear.
Yeah, it's mistranslation.
But that means something.
It's heavy.
Something. It's heavy. And then to know that, no, really, you were so loved and wanted.
Yeah. So another funny-ish detail about that show and just the information I was given, the adoption agency had my birth mother's name spelled incorrectly on the paperwork the whole time. So, I went on the show and here's her name. Well, no one knows who that is because it was not her name. It was like there was a syllable missing, a consonant missing. But yes, that show and the story that we're told in general is even if they say you were so loved that they, quote, gave you up for a better life, you grow up thinking this is what love is. When you really love someone, you let them go, the butterfly quote, and I had so many questions growing up that, I was blessed to have answered. But one of the most important things to me is that my birth mother told me that when she held me when I was born, she wanted to hold me until she died. And it was my birth father's grandmother. He didn't come to the hospital with her, who took me out of my birth mother's arms and handed me to the social worker. So the story that I had about my birth mother initiating this and a lot of I wouldn't say resentment, but I would say I attributed my circumstances to that decision that she made. So knowing that it wasn't her choice and also learning more about Korea and patriarchy and traditions, it helped take the personal aspect out of it and understand that this is a larger systemic issue. There's many systemic issues at play here, but also that it wasn't just a trauma for me being taken from her arms, but a trauma for my Korean mother having me taken. And so it gave me a different perspective on what trauma looks like in adoption, and that it's not just one person that's affected and impacted. And there's a lot of nuance to everyone's stories that, not everyone is blessed to find out and to learn. And I think that's why I take so much pride in being able to share my story, is because I have a lot of the qualities that people think, oh, she's so well adjusted, or she had such a happy, privileged life. And still, even having been reunited with my birth family, there's a whole other level of pain and separation that comes even in reunion.
Would you be comfortable sharing more of that? You mentioned there's the cute airport video. Again, that's also on your YouTube channel. And, I'm watching it from this very different lens, right? And so I hear, extended family members, I think, saying like, oh, you can't trade her in now. Yeah. No refunds.
No returns.
Oh, she's not crying. She must be such a good baby. And I'm, seeing this look on your face like, oh my gosh, where am I? Like, looking at that baby from that perspective, it's like, it's very sad. And I did not enjoy watching that because it's like this for me, I'm looking at it being like, oh my gosh, this poor baby. Even though you had a lovely parent, I'll just, I don't want to like put something on your story that's not true, but
yeah.
And then I couldn't believe it that you were vlogging while everything was happening. Like I think you should have seen the look on my face, I think, while Stephanie was telling that YouTube video was in real time, that you were figuring those things out. Because I was like, oh, this is interesting. And you kind of said that, but I was like, oh, she's telling this after she got home, right? No.
After I got back to the hotel,
the
rest of the conference goers were like at a dinner theater event, and I was just sitting in the room and like, what do I do with all of this? And I had done a video like when I found out I was going to Korea, so I was like, well, I'll just do a little update here. And it was before YouTube was like really a thing, so I just thought it was just gonna go and it would be sort of like a live journal that nobody sees, but it's there for my personal documentation. And lo and behold, people watched and responded. But when looking at those videos, there were so many things, so much has changed since then. But I like to look back because a lot of the work that I'm doing with my therapist is on healing my inner child. And by inner child, I also mean inner young adult, because in so many ways it took me longer to really become a fully formed human. And one video that I watched, and I don't know if I still have this one up, but it was talking about somebody that I knew had just been reunited with their biological sister. And this was before I had found mine. And I remember saying, like, that's all I want. I just want to take a picture with my sisters and have like evidence that I look like someone. And I thought that was all I wanted, and I thought that if I can just get that, I'll be so happy. And so then when I did find my birth family, I should have, part of me was like, I should just be content with this. But my relationship with my sister and the time that was robbed from us, and understanding the journey that she was on is very painful in a different way. She was separated from our older sister for several years because my birth father wanted to live with his mistress, but he didn't want both of the daughters. He took only my middle sister. And she was essentially like a servant for him and his mistress. And we talked about, on my last visit, we were at a cafe and it was just me, her, and my now ex-husband, who, sweet man. We're still friends. He went through a lot with me witnessing this, but we were in a cafe and it was one of my last days there. And I said something to her, just like, I love my brother, but I always wanted a sister. And she told me about how lonely she had felt growing up. And we realized, I think at the same time, like, we should have had each other. Like we should have known that we weren't alone in these things. And we just started crying and hugging in the middle of this coffee shop. And my ex-husband's like crying off to the side. And it was just so heavy knowing that we had each other. We existed in the same lifetime all of these years and felt so alone and could have helped each other with that. And it's not enough just to have a picture with her. I will never get that time with her back. I won't get the time with my niece and nephew because of the distance and because of the language barriers. And so it's sad and sweet to look back at myself and think, like, I really thought if I found them and got this picture that would be the end. Like, that's the happy ending. And it's just, I want to go back and and hug her and say, like, be careful what you wish for, because you're opening a whole Pandora's box. You have no idea.
Well, and I've listened to you share in a few different places your story, preparing for our interview today, and I kind of try and deep dive people, and you have lots of writing out there, several interviews I listened to. And one thing you did share is, I think, something a lot of us can identify with: holding the burdens for other people's feelings while you're going through something so heavy and deeply personal. And it's like, I need everybody else to show up for me now. But oh no. Adoptee Stephanie is going to put her needs to the side and take care of other people's feelings during this time too.
It was a very emotional time, I would say, at the point where I found them. I was obviously planning a wedding, but my ex-husband and I were buying our first house together. And it was a purchase that my parents, and specifically my mom, did not necessarily approve of. They thought, we were getting in over our heads with this older house, and they wanted us to keep looking. So I had asked them to do this walkthrough with our new house before we closed. We had that scheduled on the calendar. Well, I got the email from the adoption agency like 2 days before the walkthrough. And so I called my dad and I told him, I knew that my mom couldn't handle it. I had to figure out how to tell her, but I just told him, like, please, like, know that this is going on. And I know that mom's going to be upset at the walkthrough of the house, but just like, I need you to like help, like mediate. And he's been a mediator for many years with us. I was very emotional growing up. And so at the house, we were walking through with our realtor, and my mom like lashed out at the realtor, like, you're taking advantage of these young kids just to get your commission. It was so much. And I was bawling, and I was just like, Dad, please just like take mom. Please. And he took her home, and then eventually, like, I did tell my mom what was going on. So it was just this weird dynamic where she's mad at me for the house, but she is sympathizing with what I'm going through, and they're trying to help me get to Korea. And also I'm having to plan a wedding, and it's like, Mom, did we like get the catering done? And also, like, I know you're really so mad at me about this house, but like, I'm also going through like one of the hardest things that I've ever experienced, and I need my parents. So we really had like one Starbucks, my mom and I, where she said, like, I guess, like, is this how our relationship is now? And I was like, no, that's not what I want. Like, I want you to be part of this. I want you to be part of the house. The house process. I want you to be part of, this reunion and everything. But one thing that I still, have a hard time grappling with is that I've gone to Korea without my parents all 3 times. Bringing my ex-husband in 2019 was the first time I went with somebody. And my family, we were travelers. We traveled internationally many times because my dad worked for the airlines, and we could travel standby and get flight discounts. And I did ask my mom, and I said, why didn't we ever go to Korea? And she told me, well, you never asked to go. We didn't think you wanted to. So that, I think that the going to Korea on my own is one of the most painful examples of how lonely this journey is for adoptees. And going there knowing, I love my parents and they're making this possible. And my dad, set me up in first class in this beautiful hotel, and he's trying so hard, but there's still so much that they can't understand. And then I get to Korea, and my Korean mother can't even look me in the eye. She is so full of shame. Most mornings I wake up, she just says I'm sorry over and over. And no matter how much I tell her I'm okay and I'm happy, like, we can't get past that part to have a different kind of relationship. I went thinking they were going to want to know all about me and my life, and we were going to make new memories. But I forgot that, like, I had been on this journey for a long time, and this was sort of the conclusion. Me finding them and reaching out started my birth mother on a whole other journey herself, having to grapple with this. And so I had to balance that and just the dynamics of, understanding what happened historically to my birth family and the trauma that my birth father had caused to them, and some of the damaged relationships between my sister and other family members, and getting really protective of her, but also not wanting to get mad at my, grandmother, and all of these other things that it's so much to hold. And there's really nobody else who understands that specific place in all of the families.
Thank you for being willing to share that. It's like this heavy burden, and some of it is just like thrown on us. And some of it, I think we just know this is our job, even if it's not it's not. But do you mind sharing, you said you have gone to therapy. How did you decide maybe I need some support with this? Or have you been in therapy for a long time? Do you mind talking a little bit about that? I know you've shared a little bit publicly about some mental health things.
So I did not see a therapist until I was 30 years old. And I went to therapy knowing that I had issues around adoption, but it was more preparing myself for the future. And if I was at the point where I was trying to get pregnant with my ex, and I knew that I had some issues around my own infertility or fertility struggles that I needed to work through. But I made the mistake I'm sort of a lazy medical planner. So I look for practitioners based on how close they are to me, because I don't like driving far. And there happened to be a therapist in the building that I lived, because I lived in a loft where there was businesses and residences. And she said she specialized in adoption. So I booked an appointment, went downstairs, and she's an adoptive parent. And so I start sharing some of my stories, and then specifically a white adoptive parent. And she was like, but have you considered that maybe your parent? And I was like, nope, therapy, nope, done. I will fix my own problems. I'm done. And then it was, a couple years later that I finally started seeing a therapist that was recommended to me by one of my close friends who was a woman of color and not an adoptive parent. And it was very, life-changing. I was going through a divorce and all of these other things that she was helping me through. But yeah, so my struggle with my mental health started in middle school and high school. Looking back, I know that I was suffering from depression and really, really low self-esteem, and again, internalized racism. But because I couldn't show it, because we were supposed to be grateful, we're supposed to be happy, because we don't want to put that burden on our parents, I kept it to myself and I self-mutilated. I would cut myself with a scissor blade, and I would do it. I would go lock myself in my closet, and then I would cover it with a Band-Aid. And it was just sort of it was there for me then. Anytime that I was experiencing pain, I could just take the Band-Aid off and dig into that scab and reopen it. And it would somehow zap me back into reality and keep me going. I could be like, okay, felt the pain, put the Band-Aid on it, back to rehearsal, and I had times in my life where I would go back to that coping mechanism, and it was very rare, because I had started to feel better about myself, feel more confident. But there's always those triggers that we don't anticipate. And that was actually one of the moments that I knew that my marriage was over, because something had happened that sent me back into the bathroom with a pair of scissors. And I was like, I swore I was never going to do this again, and I'm not that person anymore. And and it's a reminder that it is a lifelong struggle. It doesn't get fixed when you start going to therapy, or when you get a certain job or a certain goal achieved in life and you feel like you're an adult. Those things still haunt.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm really sorry that you experienced that, Stephanie. And thank you for sharing. I know probably there's a lot of us that can relate to having that pain that's so much, and you just need to feel it, need to get it out. And so knowing that there is this pain deep down, And you've also mentioned several times the internal racism.
Mm-hmm.
Can you pinpoint like when you figured out, I think this is adoption related? You know, like, I'm laughing kind of saying that because you have, it seems like from what you've written and shared that you have a really good relationship now with your adoptive parents and did earlier as well.
Yeah. And
even in some of your early, vlogs where you look teeny, young, a very young person, you seem just still like, I love adoption. Adoption's the best. So can you pinpoint something?
So there's a couple moments that started where the cracks started forming and light started shining through. The first was, the first trip to Korea when I was visiting the agency, and they took me into the baby's room. And it was a room. There were 2 rooms. I was in a hallway, and there's 2 glass windows for each room on either side of the hallway, and babies, filled in the cribs. And I wanted to go in and hold them, but I didn't have like proof of my vaccination records. So I was just in the hallway, and I was with a social worker. The babies were crying. That video is on my YouTube channel as well, crying to be held, to be taken care of. And there's only 2 volunteers in the room. And the social worker said to me, and she was like, that was you. And I was like, oh my God. In my mind, I was this fresh-faced, happy 3-month-old, off the airplane, not thinking about I was that baby crying and not being held. So that was one. Obviously, finding my birth family, hearing my birth mother's story. But I think what really was the eye-opener was after I came back from Korea in 2019, I decided to start writing a draft of a memoir for NaNoWriMo for National Novel Writing Month that next month. And, I got my 50,000 words. There's a lot of messy stuff in there that I still need to go back and edit someday. But what was interesting to me was writing about my failed romantic relationships and some of the impulsive decisions that I made, moving to be with a guy or staying too long in abusive relationships, and the fights that I would have with my parents about them. And I looked back and I one of the relationships was with someone that I met in Korea that first time, and he was another adoptee. And he was the person that I, the next day I talked to about my experiences. He was older. I was, fresh out of college. And I realized that trauma bonding was what drew me to him, but that he was, I didn't realize until later that he was a narcissist, and he wanted to keep me traumatized to keep that bond. And, so one of the things around that was, I finally got up the nerve to leave and move back to Texas. I was in New Jersey with him. And the story that my parents tell is that my dad sent my car up. I didn't have a car for a while I lived there, and I finally needed a car because I needed to get away from my ex one night, and I didn't have one. And so I was standing in the streets trying to figure out how to get somewhere. So my dad sent my car up, and they paid to have it, transported up there. And then shortly after, things got really bad because then I had a car and I had a way to, I had freedom. And then that made the relationship even more tenuous. And so I came back, and then my dad had to transport my car back to Texas. So the story they tell was Stephanie, she was so impulsive. We had to send the car up, and then we had to pay to send it back. And I realized they never asked why I left or why I needed the car in the first place. And, that's hard. A lot of the decisions that we make are from fight or flight, mode. And if you don't know how to name why you're in fight or flight mode, why your amygdala is hijacked, why you are being impulsive, or why you are attaching yourself to unhealthy relationships, it looks from the outside like you're just sort of a little bit nuts and making poor choices. But it's because a lot of that is driven by a need that stems from adoption. And so being able to write about these relationships and see the pattern and tell my story of what was going on versus what other people perceived, really helped me trace a through line back to that first trauma.
I'm so glad you mentioned your writing, because you're a tremendous writer. I found it really funny listening to you talk about saying in a different interview, saying how someone was like, "Oh, you're not that great a writer," and you're like, "Pardon me, I'll show you."
Time to leave.
Because I thought, wow, I don't know what she was reading, but anyway, I think you're just a tremendous writer. And so to hear you say that writing has helped you process some of that, I get that. Okay. Yeah, that totally makes sense. Well, we're going to do our recommended resources right away. And I've asked you about so many things, but I have too many more questions for you. Is there anything we didn't get to that you want to really make sure we touch on? I know you're so passionate about racial equity and righting injustice. And you've mentioned several times internalized racism. And I do have, I think, one show with a therapist who kind of unpacks that a little bit for us. I'll link that in the show notes, but maybe you can mention that, and then if there's, or just kind of explain that to us. And then if there's anything else we didn't get to.
Yeah. So the resource that I wanted to share touches on that. And it's actually a two-parter. So Laura Briggs has written two books, Somebody's Children, The Politics of Transracial and Transnational Adoption, and then Taking Children, A History of American Terror. Both of these books are really important because they talk about the historical context behind adoption and behind the welfare system. And that is what has really helped me place myself here, is learning the history of Korea, learning the history of U.S. imperialism, learning the history of the Indian Child Welfare Act. And in the work that I do, I work for an organization called Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation. And our framework was based on truth and reconciliation commissions, some that have been formed over things like Indian children being taken from their families and put up for adoption. And so I think when it comes to understanding why we're here, the root of my story, it goes way beyond my birth family. It goes, even beyond Korea or my birthplace. It is the relationship between Korea and the United States, the white supremacy that the United States has been founded on. And so those resources and understanding the history and the racist undertones behind a lot of policy has not only helped me understand where I fit in, but also given me my purpose in sharing stories that tell a different narrative than what we've been given.
Well, I mean, thank you for sharing those books. I'm really excited. I don't think I've read either of them yet, but I want to mention, Mike, my resource for everyone is your creative baby, Visible magazine. And you have made that space for folks. You mentioned earlier you wanted to create a space for fellow adoptees, but also other underrepresented groups. So I just want to read, these are your words from launching a couple years ago now, right? What year did you start it?
It's going to be 3 years in April. So.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Yeah. So April 2019, you started this. Okay. Visible Magazine is an online publication committed to making storytelling accessible and inclusive. We actively privilege the work of those from underrepresented communities whose voices are often overlooked by traditional media outlets. You talk a little bit about submissions, and then you say, we are holding space for your stories whenever and however you want to tell them. You belong here. Your voice matters. Those words give me chill bumps because I so relate to wanting to make a space for the unheard. And I think I've read so many pieces on Visible, some of yours, just tremendous. I'll link to a couple of those for people, but also just so many different writers expressing just, can you just tell us a couple of either favorites or tell us about just like, I was like looking for a list of like all the different topics people have covered, but like there's so many. So just highlights. Give us our highlights.
So the Visible came about in two ways. It was wanting to share adoptee voices, stories like my own, but also I was part of a fellowship with other women from underrepresented communities. And the whole idea was to use op-ed writing to put your thoughts into the world. And we had these incredible mentors from the op-ed project who were helping pitch our stories and helping us craft these really powerful opinion pieces. But then we would submit it to editors and they would come back and say, well, if you don't have a PhD on this topic, it's going to be hard to publish you. We had a local opinion editor in the room with us while we were live pitching. And she said, our subscription base is white, middle-class men. Unless you can change the hook to make it appeal to them, we're going to have a hard time placing it. And so after that session, I actually went home that night and started Visible. And so some of my favorite pieces.
That's a true story. That's the best part. That's like one night you just bought the domain, set up the website, done.
So that's the other thing, like in my previous life or in careers, I was in fashion blogging and influencer marketing, so I would do websites for other people, and so that, that's a whole other conversation. But I would say one of the earliest pieces that I published on Visible, and one that was really close to my heart, was by a young Chinese adoptee named Gracie Howard, who I mentored for several years. So through my YouTube channel, somebody found my videos and reached out to someone they knew who was a mutual friend and said, my niece is an adoptee and is having trouble. She was 13 years old around that time. Would Stephanie be willing to meet with her because we lived in the same area? So her parents took me out to dinner and I met Gracie, and we just kept going to Korean barbecue. And as she grew older, her and I would go get coffee on our own or go get food. And she was in a similar situation to where I was at that age, where she was struggling with how she felt about adoption. And, fortunately for her, her mom was an incredible, she's a therapist herself, and recognized that it was important for Gracie to have mirrors. So I shared the launch of Visible, and Gracie asked if she could write for it. And she wrote 3 ways being an Asian adoptee has changed my life. And, it was like a full circle moment, because the way that she was thinking about it was so close to some of the thought patterns that I had over the years, and I just had nowhere to share it. And so now, I got to see. We always talk about wanting to be who we needed or wanting to make what we needed. And that was the moment that I felt like, okay, I accomplished that.
You did it. Oh my gosh. I'm so moved by the fact that that's a great story, and that you made it. You made a thing. People are sharing. It's tremendous. I really hope everyone goes and checks it out. I'll link to a couple of things you wrote. We'll link to Gracie's article as well, so you can check that out. And it isn't just adoptee stories, which if it was, that would be enough. But you have representation from so many different voices. It's just really beautiful. Mm-hmm. And you have so many amazing articles on your website. You blog there. You have a fun side, Stephanie, on Instagram. I was going to ask you about pole dancing, but I didn't. So you'll just have to follow for more. Oh my gosh, it was so good to talk with you. I would love it if you would share with everyone where they can connect with you online.
Sure. I'm not super creative, so you can find me at Stephanie Drenka everywhere, and my website is stephaniedrenka.com. So from there, you can find all of my my writing on adoption, as well as links to Visible magazine to read some other pieces.
Absolutely. I know people will be loving that. More clicks. That's so good. Thank you for sharing your story with us and some of the hard parts. I really appreciate your candor with us.
Thank you for creating this space. And really, I shared things with you that I haven't shared in my writing and on other podcasts. And I think that speaks to the really safe space that you've created with this podcast. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. Isn't she amazing? Oh my goodness. I feel so fortunate at all the amazing, amazing adoptees I get to talk to. I wanted to remind you of just a couple things that are happening. Adoptee Lit Fest is coming up. It's on April 9th and it's free. And so if you go to adopteelitfest.com, you can register there. It's online. It's got several different Zoom presentations throughout the day with various adoptee authors, many of whom you have heard before on this podcast. We are so lucky to have interviewed many of them. So adopteelitfest.com. And so I want to make sure as many folks go to that and support it as possible. It is just like one of those things where, again, it's like a free service to the community. There are some really incredible people volunteering to organize it and speak at it, including, Stephanie today is on the advisory board of Adoptee Lit Fest. So I wanted to make sure I mentioned it to you. And other things happening in Adoptees On world, we have our ongoing Adoptees Only book club for Patreon supporters. And for the month of April, we are going to be reading Bastards by Mary Anna King, and she is going to be joining us for that book club discussion. So we're really excited to invite her back on the show and talk about her memoir. Honestly, so many good things. I'm so thankful that we can serve the community in this way and that there's free opportunities. And also, if you support the show through Patreon to help pay for the cost of running Adoptees On, that's what we have those extra bonuses for over on Patreon, like the book club and the Adoptees Off Script podcast, which is also weekly. And there's another level where you can join and access the private Facebook group as well. I am so honored to keep making this show for you. Thank you for listening, and let's talk again next Friday.